the winter of 1343, when the roads out of Norwich froze, in the nights and markets closed by dusk, the countryside looked smaller than it really was, narrower, because people made it so, shutting their doors against strangers, and sealing their windows with hope more than with iron. In that season, every coin was counted twice, every favor measured, and every shadow on the lane was given a face by rumor. It is into such shadows that our story begins. For men who did not belong to any one village, for they moved like a stain across county lines, taking what they could for the small price of a life. They were known to a handful of folk as merchants' friends, to others as tradesmen, and to a terrified few as the black-handed. None of the names they used were their own in the full sense. Names in those days were soft things, borrowed and dropped like cloaks when a new road required new wool. But the constable's reports, the scattered notes kept by an anxious bailiff, and later the hushed testimonies recorded at the coroner's inquest, give us fragments. A laird, called Fenn, Thomas of Gray, Jory Lark, and Rowan Marsh, 4 men with different faces, different pasts, and a common appetite for coin that cost blood. They did not begin as killers, not in any documented sense. A laird, the oldest of them, was once a carter who lost his wagon to a river and his family to a fever. Something in him hardened when land and law could offer no restitution. Thomas of Gray learned to read a bit and used letters to arrange affairs for other men. A clerk, in a minor manner, who watched how wealth moved and how easily it vanished into court fees and tithes. Jory Lark was a tinker who could mend a pot, pick a lock, and flatter a widow. Rowan Marsh had been a soldier in the mustering that followed a border raid, and he brought with him a patience for violence the others lacked. Each carried a grievance, but it was not grievance alone that made them what they became. It was opportunity and transaction. They learned that some men would pay to have a rival removed, to end a troublesome marriage, to make an inconvenient heir disappear. They worked in pairs at first, then in a ring where each man provided what the others lacked. They offered no sermon or justification beyond what a merchant might say when opening his stall. Straightforward accounts, prices by measure. They kept no ledger that has been found. The business was kept in breath and lockbox, in whispered meetings beneath inns, where lanterns masked faces and ale loosened tongues. The arrangements were made in a language of coin and seals. Payment was given half on agreement, half when the deed was done. Sometimes payment came in the form of a small field, a lease on a parcel of peatland, a promise of protection for a widow who feared other men more than the law. Money, in a time when money was less common, was a promise of ease, and for men who had little, the promise was great. Their methods varied, so they might never be pinned to one pattern. A laird favored cunning, a staged theft, a flame in a granary, a sudden accident at the ford. Thomas provided alibis and forged papers, a bill written in a scribe's hand, a note of debt, a landlord's dismissal. Jory acted as scout. He found the times when the household was weakest, the nights when the light in a window was low enough to slip a rope or a blade. Rowan did what the others could not. He brought force, the bluntness of a cudgel at the back of a head, the quiet strangling that left little evidence beyond the stillness. What made them so dangerous was not merely their skill, but the world that sheltered them, in a time when manorial justice moved slowly, and when disputes could be paid off in ale and meat. A well-arranged death could be made to look like misfortune, disease, or robbery. Many deaths in that era had plausible lies wearing them, a fall from a ladder, a fever that took hold with strange swiftness, a violent tenant fleeing into the dark. The coroner's inquest, a new and imperfect instrument of the sheriff, relied on neighbors, who would not speak ill will into a voice that might be heard by the wrong ears. The killers used that silence to their favor. Their first known arrangement took place on the road between 2 market towns. A reeve and minor yeoman had coveted a small farm that lay between them, and a quarrel over grazing rights turned to negotiation. A rich merchant of the town, austere, with a ledger as long as his palm, approached the ring, because the yeoman threatened to reveal a long-hidden fraud. Half a mark now, half later, the contract read. A night in spring would settle the matter. They met his terms. A fall at the well, the village said afterwards. Misfortune, the wife sobbed. The merchant took the field and paid the rest. The four men learned two things from that first act. The law believed the honest grief of a household over the claim of a man of letters. And coins spoke in higher tones than confession. They were not brutal in the way brigands could be. They did not spill their fury openly. They were not roaming cutthroats, but they were precise. Like surgeons who understood that unnecessary spectacle risked a surgeon's own life. Their trade required it, for each successful arrangement brought money, and each money gift granted them the means to buy different kinds of silence. A hand in the market who would say nothing, the innkeeper who would avert his eyes, a priest who would bury a body at night. This was not simply greed. It was an industry of survival for the winter months, when coin meant coal and grain and the possibility of staying alive until the spring. Rumors spread like maps that had holes. Some whispered that the four were demons in human guise. Others insisted they were agents of nobility who needed plausible deniability. The truth was dustier. They were men who understood how the world worked and used that knowledge to make a living the only way they saw fit. They did not act on passion, but on calculation. That coldness made them more fearsome than a band of vagabonds, because it implied there were no stops to their commerce. If a man would pay, the men would provide a service. Not everyone who sought their help was desperate. Often, the wealthy used them. A lord whose second wife refused to yield her dower found it simpler to negotiate with the ring than to tussle in court. A shopkeeper tired of a violent apprentice found late-night counsel in Jory's ears. A monk, aware of a brother's secret prayer book that might embarrass the abbey, found a lord quick with a solution. Wealth made them clients. Trouble made new opportunities. The killers did not ask whether a man deserved death, only whether he would pay. As their ledger of deeds lengthened, their methods were refined. No longer would they rely on the flames of a hearth to do their work, for arson invited a swift inquest. Instead, they staged misdirection. A loosened beam on a staircase, a spiked wheel on a cart, an engineered drowning in the backwater where reeds hid the evidence. Thomas forged a letter or two that placed a man in a distant fair at the time of his death. He bought the convenience of witnesses by paying for their ale and lodging. Jory's hands grew skilled not only at picking locks, but at making it appear that a house had been plundered rather than emptied. Rowan's soldier's patience turned to a near art of improvisation, the right angle of a push in the dark, the small cut that bled a man into quiet regardless of the lack of a single scream. They took pains to avoid patterns that would draw the sheriff's attention. They swapped roles. Sometimes Allard carried the money. Sometimes Jory acted as the blade, so that any sense of identity blurred. They avoided villages where folk remembered faces too well. They kept their purchases discreet. A dozen hens here, a rusted axe there, a horse traded in a different shire under a new name. They were craftsmen of disappearance in a time that lacked modern detection. But no enterprise goes unchained by greed or small missteps, and the ring was not immune. The first real crack in their operation came when a debtor, cheated of his small field after his creditor died in suspicious circumstances, refused to be silenced by an offer of coin. He followed the merchant who had paid the ring and watched him deposit a chest. The man was not a scholar. He was a crier at the fair who loved nothing more than to see justice done. He kept to shadows and curiosity, and, by chance, or by fate, saw Rowan across a lane speaking with a foreign trader late into the night. Enough pieces, when gathered, begin to tell a story. The crier took his complaint to a local priest who listened in the light of an oil lamp, her hands clasped and knuckles white. The priest, fearing scandal, whispered first to the bailiff, then to the sheriff. The sheriff was a man both worn and ambitious. Where law offered him the chance of reputation, he saw not only order, but power. He had been in office but 2 years, and wished to show that his name could bend justice as well as follow it. The complaint was small supper talk on one chilly afternoon when a widow was buying soap, but the sheriff paid attention for reasons of his own. The web that foreman had woven, spun from coin and shadows, was 3 threads away from being plucked. Their world began to shrink. Men who had once been content to turn a blind eye now felt the pressure of a sheriff who wanted to be seen to act. Inquest after inquest pulled up patterns. A bridge accident too close to a merchant's gain. A fall in a cellar timed oddly with a transfer of property. A drowning where the boat bore fresh, disguised marks. The killers adapted at first. They moved their operations to different towns, took furtive lodgings, and used children to move messages. But their manner of life required a certain permanence of contact. Transactions demanded trust. Trust is the first thing to break when a man fears being hanged. In Scene 1, we begin not with the act the world would call their greatest, but with the ordinary hour when a new client came seeking remedy. He was a small man with a large problem. His brother had married in secret and produced an heir who threatened the small estate the client had planned to inherit. The client came at dusk, hooded, with a purse that shone in the lamplight. He asked for something quiet, for disposal of the boy's father in a way that would not be whispered about beyond the parish. He would pay half the sum now, the rest when the deed was done. They met in an inn where the walls were damped with years, and the chandlery kept a low flame. They had chosen the place because the innkeeper's son was on good terms with Jory, a friendship bought with a few repairs to a broken cart, and promises of coin for nights the son could not use. The men accepted the job, each nodding with a businesslike gravity. That night, the 4 men walked like any others through the market lane. They carried rope and a pack of clothes, a ledger, and a tidy bag of nails. They took with them the kind of patience that waits for the right breath of wind, the right moment when a man will step off a ladder, or when a horse will stumble. The winter air smelled of woods. A woman in a doorway called to her child and pulled him close. Far from them, in another home, the boy whose life had been offered for sale slept under a threadbare quilt, oblivious to how his name would be traded. This was the rhythm of their trade, negotiations in daylight, precise work at night, settlements in the morning. In the coming hours, a task would be carried out. A coin would change hands, and a new silence would be sown into the countryside. What follows from that night is not simply the tale of a single death. It is the slow revelation of how a lawless commerce can grow in the gaps where institutions fail, and of how 4 men, clever and terrible in small measured ways, would come to be named by a county that would later try to remember them with both awe and the chill of horror. The morning after the meeting at the inn came colder than any in recent weeks. Frost held to the thatch and froze the edges of the well buckets, so that every rope rang when drawn. In a house near the outer fields of Stowbridge, the man marked for death, Edward Halling, rose before dawn to tend his horses. He had the calm of someone who expected no harm. A farmer with modest holdings and a newlywed wife who still slept while the hearth smoked. The 4 killers were already on the move before he even opened his stable door. They had spent the night apart to avoid suspicion. Allard slept in the hayloft of the same inn where the meeting had taken place. Jory kept to a cooper's shed under pretense of helping with repairs. Thomas sat in a small rented room copying notes from a borrowed book of accounts, and Rowan disappeared into the woods at the edge of the parish. Their discipline was a habit now. Never together by day, never seen in talk when the world was awake. When the bells tolled prime, they moved in patterns they had rehearsed dozens of times. Allard walked toward the fields with a sack over his shoulder, posing as a trader. Jory took the back lane, his hands gloved, though he had no cold, for he was to handle the implements. Thomas waited by the river ford where any pursuit might be delayed. Rowan, the soldier, lay in wait among the hedgerows, with a hood drawn low. Edward's house stood near a slope where the ground broke unevenly into a ditch that filled with runoff each rain. It was that ditch Allard had marked the night before as the place of accident. The plan was simple: a slip while fetching water, a broken neck at the bottom, a discovery too late for saving. Such deaths were common, and the countryside seldom asked too many questions when cold and mud had already claimed their share. But fate rarely holds steady when men think themselves clever. The day went wrong from its first hour. Edward's brother, the client, had been seen at a tavern, boasting of soon having his affairs settled. Words in alehouse corners travel faster than any horse, and a cousin of Edward's overheard enough to suspect trouble. Before noon, that cousin had made the short ride to Edward's farm, urging him to stay indoors and keep his servants near. The warning unsettled the pattern of the killer's work. Jory, watching from a distance, saw the cousin leave and knew that if the deed were not done that very evening, the suspicion might grow teeth. When dusk came, the countryside went quiet under a thickening mist. The four regrouped near the old mill by the water's edge, its wheel still now that winter had starved the stream. Jory spoke first, anxious that the risk was growing. "We should wait till he rides to market," he said. "No one'll ask how a horse shied on a frosted road." But Rowan, who had fought men face to face and hated delay, shook his head. "The client wants the man gone before the week's end. If the cousin stirs the sheriff, we lose both coin and safety." Allard weighed the choice silently. In his eyes lay the fatigue of a man who had seen too many winters of doubt. "We do it tonight," he decided. Quick, quiet, like a candle snuffed. They moved as a unit, though none spoke after that. The mist muffled every sound but the crunch of their boots on frozen ruts. The farmhouse stood dimly lit, one candle flickering through the window. Inside, Edward's wife hummed while stirring a pot, and the smell of barley broth drifted into the yard. Edward, washing his hands at the basin, never saw the shape that loomed behind the window before stepping out to fetch wood. Rowan followed him silently, a short length of rope coiled under his coat. Allard stayed by the gate to keep watch, while Jory slipped toward the stable to drive the horses into a noise that might mask the struggle. Thomas remained by the road, eyes on both ends, ready to intercept any stray traveler. When Edward bent for the woodpile, Rowan moved. A twist of the rope, a sudden pull. But the ground was slicker than expected. Edward turned with surprising strength, grabbing the rope and yanking Rowan down into the mud. The two men wrestled, breath steaming, boots scraping. A lantern inside fell from its hook as the wife heard the commotion. Jory rushed forward to help, catching Edward's arm and forcing him down. But in the scuffle, the rope slipped, and the farmer's head struck a stone at the ditch's edge. The sound that followed was small, a dull crack, the sigh of breath leaving a body, but to the men who heard it, it echoed long after. Silence came again, except for the horse's restless snorts and the faint wail of a woman's voice calling her husband's name. Allard gestured sharply, and they dragged the body into the ditch. Rowan's hands shook not from remorse but from the cold as he wiped the rope and pressed it into the mud. Jory broke the lantern to make it appear the man had fallen while tending the fire outside. They moved with grim efficiency, leaving footprints blurred by their own passing. When they slipped back into the fog, the farmhouse looked as it had an hour before, save for the faint shape lying half in water and half on earth. Before dawn, Thomas rode to the appointed meeting place, a small bridge near the edge of the shire, where the client waited with the rest of the payment. The man's hands trembled as he passed the purse. He did not ask details, only nodded once and turned his horse. Thomas counted the silver by touch beneath his cloak. Business concluded. Yet even he could feel that this one had gone wrong in the air around them. Too hurried, too many witnesses half unseen. Too much noise in a world that thrived on silence. The next day brought the first rumor. A neighbor had found Edward dead and called for the priest. The coroner, summoned reluctantly, marked the death as an accident, but noted the bruises on the neck and a cut near the temple. He sent word to the sheriff, who remembered the old complaint about strange men traveling between parishes. The sheriff ordered quiet inquiry, nothing public yet, a few questions to innkeepers, a word to the toll collector at the bridge. For the first time, the ring's name began to pass between officials who might actually care. The four killers regrouped 2 nights. Later, at a burned-out chapel they sometimes used as shelter, the wind whistled through its broken roof, carrying the smell of damp stone and soot. Allard laid the coins on a cloth, each piece gleaming dull in the moonlight. "Half goes to the usual hands," he said, meaning the innkeeper, the ferryman, the silent. "The rest we divide." Rowan muttered about bad omens, about the way the wife had cried. Thomas dismissed it with a tired shrug. "We've done worse with cleaner faces," he said. Yet Jory, usually the one to joke, sat quiet. He had seen the wife kneel by the ditch, her face lit by the lantern she carried. Something in that sight unsettled even his well-worn indifference. Weeks passed, and winter deepened. The ring continued its work, though with more caution. They changed inns, altered routes, spoke less even among themselves. But the air of England in those years was restless. Famine in one shire, revolt in another, new taxes everywhere. Movement drew attention now. Sheriffs and bailiffs, eager to prove loyalty to the crown, began keeping lists of wanderers and asking for letters of passage for men whose livelihood depended on being unknown. Such lists were poison. In early spring, a traveler's gossip reached the sheriff's ear. 4 men seen leaving the parish on the same night as Holling's death, one of them carrying a bundle shaped suspiciously like a weapon. The sheriff, seizing the chance for glory, ordered pursuit. 2 constables were sent to track them, one of whom had once been a soldier under Rowan's command years before. Recognition is a slow dagger, and it would find its mark soon enough. For now, the killers still walked free, unaware that the pattern of their own discipline had finally betrayed them. Every route they took, every inn they trusted, every alias they had woven into the dark was now being slowly, carefully untied by hands that wanted reward more than justice. And as the frost gave way to thawing mud and the first lambs of spring were born, the ring that had thrived on silence began to echo in whispered prayers of fear, and in the records of men who would soon give them names to history. By the time spring's thaw loosened the rivers of East Anglia, the 4 killers had scattered like crows, startled from a field. Their compact had always been built on secrecy, but fear was a stronger wedge than loyalty. The death of Edward Holling had left a wound in their trade, not only because it drew attention, but because the sheriff's men had begun to take interest in wanderers, and the countryside, once tolerant of strangers who paid for ale, now watched every unfamiliar face with suspicion. For a few weeks, Allard and Thomas kept near the coast, posing as petty traders moving wool and salt between villages. Rowan vanished inland, toward Ely, taking refuge among old comrades from his soldiering days. Jory drifted from tavern to tavern, pretending to mend pots and singing rough songs for coin. Their plan was simple: lie low until the talk of the Holling death softened, then find each other again when the roads grew busier. But England in that age was small in its gossip and vast in its memory, and men with secrets were always followed by their own shadows. One evening, near the town of Downham, Thomas sat in a corner of an inn with parchment spread before him, forging letters for a merchant who did not exist. He wore the calm of a clerk, neat beard, quiet eyes, and the innkeeper thought him harmless. That calm was what had kept them alive for years. Thomas could talk like a scholar and lie like a saint. Yet on that night, a knock came at the door, and the sheriff's deputy entered with 2 men in livery, asking questions about a certain traveler who had lodged here before Candlemas. Thomas listened, heart steady, but pulse fast, as they described a scribe with an injured hand, seen at the ferry near Stowbridge. He folded the parchment, wiped the ink, and excused himself for air. When he slipped out through the back courtyard, the moonlight showed his breath like smoke from a furnace visible, fleeting, a warning of its own. He rode until dawn, leaving behind the coastal roads and turning north where the fens were still flooded. There, amid the black reeds, he found Allard waiting in a thatched hut they had once used as shelter during older work. The old carter was thinner now, his beard gone to white. He was boiling a pot of eel stew and muttering to himself when Thomas entered. "They're asking about us," Thomas said, sitting by the fire. Allard nodded without surprise. "They were bound to," he replied. Too many hands touched the same coin. The two men spoke in low tones, weighing what was left of their small empire. "Rowan will not stay hidden long," Thomas said. "He's a soldier, not a ghost." Allard stirred the pot, then looked up, and "He'll talk first." He was never built for silence. That name hung in the air like a curse. Jory, they both knew, was reckless when alone. He liked company, needed it, drank too freely, and thought himself clever enough to play both sides of any danger. In truth, his charm had always been their weakness. 2 days later, their fears proved true. In a tavern on the edge of King's Lynn, Jory was caught boasting after 1 cup too many. The tale he told was half song, half confession, of a business once done for a wealthy man who wanted his brother gone, of a rope that slipped and a coin that sang. The patrons laughed, taking it for drunken invention, but one among them, a merchant servant, recognized the echo of an inquest he had read aloud for his master. He went to the sheriff that same night. By week's end, Jory Lark was in custody, chained in a cold cell beneath the sheriff's hall. He still smiled, still pretended to misunderstand the gravity of his situation, until the first lash of questioning took the smile from his mouth. Under oath, under pain, the human voice betrays its own body. Jory gave names, not at first, but by degrees, like a man trying to buy back his breath. Allard, Thomas, Rowan, the ring complete. The sheriff listened and ordered scribes to write every word. The man who had once been a tinker became the thread by which the others would be. Dragged into daylight, news travels faster than men on horseback. Thomas heard of the arrest before the sheriff's men reached the fen. He and Allard packed what few coins remained, burned their papers, and argued by the firelight. "We run," Thomas said, "north to Lincolnshire. New names, new trade." Allard's gaze was heavy with years of mistrust. "You run," he said quietly. "I'm done with it. I've buried too many lies already." Thomas cursed him, took the horse, and vanished into the marsh road, leaving the old man staring into smoke that rose like a ghost of everything they had built. Rowan, meanwhile, had found work guarding a convoy of grain bound for Cambridge. He rode at the rear, sword at his side, thinking himself safe in the crowd. But when they stopped at a small priory for rest, he saw the sheriff's banner approaching down the lane. He recognized the man leading it, his former sergeant, the one who knew his face too well. Rowan ran, cutting through the fields, but the mud slowed him. The pursuit lasted half a mile before he stumbled, and the cudgel struck his shoulder. They brought him back bleeding and furious, cursing the names of every man who had ever paid him by midsummer. 3 of the 4 were in the sheriff's custody, Jory, broken, Rowan silent, and Allard brought in by the quiet betrayal of a ferryman who wanted silver more than conscience. Thomas alone remained at large. The sheriff, savoring his success, sent proclamations to neighboring shires, describing Thomas Gray, clerk and deceiver, wanted for conspiracy to murder. The Crown's justices, ever eager for examples, ordered a public trial at Norwich. It was not common in those years for hired killers to face open justice. Most such crimes dissolved into rumor long before reaching court. But this case had weight. A nobleman had whispered to the sheriff that it might. pleased the king's council to see discipline imposed. And so, the proceedings began in the great hall, with townsfolk pressing to the doors, hungry for the spectacle of sin exposed. Jory was carried in first, pale and trembling, his wrists bound in iron. When asked to name his companions, he did so in a voice cracked by shame and fear. Allard and Rowan were brought in next, both gaunt from weeks in the jail. The testimonies that followed filled pages, not all truthful, not all coherent, but enough to paint a picture of trade and death. Contracts whispered, payments made, lives ended like extinguished candles. The sheriff preened, certain his name would be written into local history. Outside, the sky turned the color of ash. Inside, the crowd murmured prayers, half out of pity, half out of fascination. Thomas, hearing of the trial from afar, moved from village to village under false identity. He worked briefly as a scribe for a monastery, copying verses about sin and redemption that made him almost laugh. Yet every bell, every shout on the road made him look over his shoulder. When he learned that his companions had confessed, he knew the hunt would end only one way. He sold his horse, took the money, and sought passage to the coast. But fate, in those days, was not kind to men who mistook distance for safety. A storm struck the coast near Yarmouth the night he arrived. Ships were grounded, and travelers were herded into barns. Among them was a man who wore the sheriff's badge under his cloak, a courier carrying orders for the arrest of Thomas Gray. In the confusion, the two men spoke, shared ale, and when the courier stepped outside to relieve himself, Thomas saw the seal on his belt. He drew his knife, meaning to silence fate itself, but the wind caught the barn door, revealing them both to the others inside. The crowd shouted, seized him, and by dawn, the same sheriff who had begun this chase stood over Thomas's bound body. By Michaelmas, all four stood trial in Norwich. The verdict was swift, the punishment unsurprising, to be hanged by the neck until dead. Records say the townsfolk came in great number. Drawn by the novelty of it, men executed not for rage or theft, but for business. As they were led to the gallows, Allard whispered a prayer no one heard. Jory wept. Rowan stared straight ahead. Thomas tried to speak, but his voice failed. The ropes swung, the crowd sighed, and England forgot them soon after. Though some said the fields where they fell grew strangely barren for years, yet the story did not end with their deaths. The sheriff, now lauded, grew proud, and in his pride began to use the same methods he had condemned: favors for coin, silence for gold. Within 2 years, he too would fall under accusation of murder for hire, a cruel echo of the very trade he had destroyed. In the end, perhaps that is what England learned from the 4 black-handed men, that evil, once paid for, never truly vanishes. It only changes the hands that count the silver. The gallows had been torn down by the following spring. Grass grew where the scaffold had stood, and the rope, cut into pieces by onlookers who wanted a relic of justice, had found its way into dozens of cottages, hung over hearths, or tucked into drawers as charms against wickedness. Norwich went back to its trades, its quarrels, its prayers. To most, the story of the 4 killers ended the day their bodies were taken down and buried in unmarked earth outside the city gate. But memory, in a land like England's, never dies. Cleanly, it lingers in the air, in the gossip of markets, in the dreams of those who think the past can be buried with soil. The first whisper came from a tanner named Cole, who claimed that in the fog one dawn he saw a man walking by the marshes, his hands bound in shadow as if by invisible rope. Others laughed, yet within days a fisherman swore he had heard voices by the river, 4 men murmuring like traders striking a deal. It might have been the wind, or the rush of water through reeds, but rumors thrive better than reason. Within a month, people said the land itself was cursed where the killers had last walked. Horses shied from the path near Stowbridge Ditch. Dogs howled without cause. and a woman gathering herbs found her basket overturned, though no one had passed. The church, fearing unrest, ordered prayers of cleansing. Priests recited psalms in the fields where the bodies had lain, and processions carried holy water to the edge of the marsh. But among the villagers, belief took darker shape. They said that when the four died, they did not go quietly. Their souls, unconfessed and unshriven, wandered, and those who handled blood for coin would one day hear them again. In that same year, the sheriff who had brought them to justice began to change. His name was Henry Ashcombe, a proud man, ambitious, fond of the attention his triumph had earned. At first he dismissed the tales as peasant nonsense, but his sleep grew restless. Servants heard him pacing at night, muttering names: a lord, Jory, Rowan, Thomas. Once, a maid found him standing in the courtyard staring at the spot where the prisoner's cart had once halted, whispering as though two unseen figures. "You got what you deserved," he said aloud, though no one had spoken. His fortunes, so bright after the trial, began to falter. Disputes arose over his accounts, and rumors of bribery surfaced, the same kind of whispers he had once exploited. Witnesses vanished before hearings. Papers disappeared from his chest. One night his steward fled, leaving a note that said only, "They have come for their due." In the weeks that followed, strange occurrences marked the sheriff's house. Coins turned black overnight, metal tarnished in locked drawers. His horse refused to enter the stable. On the 13th night of Lent, the watchman swore he saw four shapes moving through the courtyard, mist, silent, deliberate, walking as men once did when going to their work. The next morning, the sheriff was found in his study, head bowed over his ledger, heart stopped, though no wound was on him. The ink on the page had smeared into the shape of four fingerprints. The story spread faster than plague. Some said guilt had killed him. Others believed vengeance walked on legs unseen. The church buried him with rites, but no honors. The official account called it a sudden seizure of the heart. Yet the townsfolk knew what they believed. The Black-Handed took him, they whispered. They always collect their debts. Years passed. Children grew up hearing the story as warning. Do not bargain with sin, for it will one day count its coins. Travelers passing through East Anglia spoke of an uncanny stillness in the air around certain fields. At dusk, the fog hung heavier there, and the crows gathered in fours. Some said that if you listened closely near the old ditch where Edward Halling had died, you could still hear the sound of rope tightening or the scrape of boots moving away into darkness. Centuries turned. The land changed hands, the villages expanded, and the old roads were paved. Yet in the records kept by Norwich historians, small notes remain, reports of laborers who refused to dig near a certain patch of ground, of lights seen at night, moving in a pattern like men walking side by side. The scholars dismiss it as folklore. Still, each generation finds reason to retell the tale, because in every age there are those who think death can be purchased cleanly, as if morality were a coin to be exchanged. And in every age, men who hear that story feel a chill not from the ghosts of Allard, Jory, Rowan, or Thomas, but from the realization that the kind of bargain they made never truly ended. It simply took new forms. Soldiers paid to silence, merchants paid to ruin, men who weigh human life against gold. The ring of killers was long gone, their bones dust beneath nameless earth, yet the idea of them persisted that for men, united by greed and skill, could make a business of death and call it work. Even in modern days, when the air hums with machines and not crows, their names sometimes return in whispers among scholars and storytellers. They are not remembered for the murders alone, but for the question they leave behind: how much of a man's soul is lost when he begins to think of killing his labor? Some say on cold nights near Norwich, when fog creeps over the fields and the moon is thin as a coin, you can see four figures walking, not cruel, not kind, just purposeful. They do not look at you. They move as if the centuries were nothing, as if their trade were still unfinished. And if you listen hard enough, past the rustle of grass and the distant toll of the church bell, you might hear the faint clink of silver. Being counted, the sound of payment, once promised, never truly spent. That is how the legend of the Black-Handed ends, not with a final breath, but with an echo that refuses to fade. The heat of summer had settled heavily over Norfolk, turning the roads into dust and the rivers sluggish. Even the countryside, used to hardship, seemed to bend beneath the weight of the sun. It was during this season, years after their initial crimes, that the four killers now operating again, though scattered, began to assert a more terrifying control over the region. What had once been simple transactions for coin now grew into a network of influence, their work evolving from discreet murders to acts that could sway entire towns. Allard, oldest and sharpest in cunning, had taken residence in a crumbling manor on the outskirts of King's Lynn. From there, he orchestrated movements like a general. Merchants who owed debts disappeared, their estates quietly seized by men he sent under the guise of law. He kept a ledger now, hidden beneath floorboards, noting every favor, every threat, every payment. Villagers whispered about the strange way disputes were suddenly resolved in his favor, livestock claimed, crops reassigned, debts canceled, or doubled. His reputation had grown beyond fear of the sheriff. Even magistrates tread carefully, knowing the wrong glance might cost them their livelihood. Thomas, meanwhile, had become an unseen force in Norwich itself. Posing as a scrivener, an accountant, he now wielded his skills to control the flow of commerce. Contracts mysteriously voided, inheritances redirected, letters that could ruin a man vanished from the chancery without explanation. His power was invisible, but absolute. The merchant who had thought himself safe now found his fortunes reversed, and no court or priest could remedy it. Thomas understood influence like a weapon, sharper than a blade. The right word in the right ledger could kill silently, with no bloodshed to mark the deed. Jory Lark had returned to his old skill with deception, but expanded it. He now operated as a shadow among the coastal towns, smuggling messages, information, and sometimes bodies. He had discovered the strength of rumor. A single whispered story about a missing heir, a corrupt bailiff, or a sinful priest could topple trust and elevate his patron's desires. Jory's charm allowed him to slip unnoticed into the homes of the wealthy, read letters, plant secrets, and vanish before anyone suspected his presence. Fear of his intelligence became a tool as effective as the rope and knife he once carried. Rowan Marsh, the soldier, had grown even more dangerous. No longer simply a man of brute force, he had begun recruiting others, teaching them methods of intimidation and exacting obedience. He would ride into villages, not to kill openly, but to demonstrate his lethal capability. One story tells of a man accused of hiding a widow's inheritance. Rowan dragged him into the town square, held him by the hair, and whispered promises of what he could do. The man fainted from terror, and when he awoke, he signed over the documents that Rowan demanded. Stories like this traveled far, and soon. Rowan's presence alone was sufficient to bend the will of ordinary men. Their coordination was now subtle, but omnipresent. Allard kept track of those who owed allegiance or fear. Thomas manipulated the economy and records. Jory spread rumors and controlled information. Rowan enforced compliance through the threat of violence. The four no longer needed to be together to act. Their influence stretched like invisible fingers into every town, farm, and market in East Anglia. The people began speaking in whispers. They see all. They know all. To cross them is death. To ignore them is ruin. It began with a small town by the Ouse River. A wealthy widow's property was targeted. Her farm, her livestock, her savings. Allard's men made quiet threats. Thomas forged documents giving claim to another distant relative. Jory spread rumors that the widow had bewitched her late husband. Rowan, in person, ensured compliance. By the week's end, the widow had ceded half her property, agreeing to terms dictated by men who had never formally spoken to her, and the rest of the town watched silently, learning the lesson. Word of these actions reached Norwich and surrounding shires. Merchants and magistrates grew wary, even those who had previously disdained the notion of supernatural or malevolent. Power began attributing almost mystical ability to the killers. Some whispered that they had the devil's favor. Others claimed that their eyes could see through walls, their hands strike from shadows, and their voices bend the will of men and women alike. The stories were exaggerated, but their effect was real. Townsfolk paid taxes early, disputed claims quietly, and no one resisted the demands of unknown hands. In the evening, the four sometimes met in secret, each reporting what they had accomplished. Allard counted the coins and lands gained. Thomas detailed contracts quietly rewritten. Jory described rumors that had caused panic, and Rowan listed those who now feared him into obedience. They shared little else. Trust was measured in success, and loyalty to the pact that had first bound them, not in sentiment. Yet power brings risk. A traveling monk, hearing tales of their influence, began writing letters, warning the crown. Another local magistrate secretly plotted to intercept Thomas and expose his forgeries. Even among the killers, whispers of betrayal surfaced. Could one of them take all the gains for themselves? Their empire, though formidable, had weaknesses. Still, their reach grew. Villagers began offering tribute before being asked. Merchants placed payments in advance to ensure safety. Minor lords deferred disputes lest they incur wrath. The four men, once simple killers for hire, had become architects of fear, their actions shaping not only death but obedience. Each town, each market, each lonely road became their domain in subtle ways. People spoke in hushed tones of the black-handed who never struck openly, yet whose power eclipsed kings in its quiet terror. And in those nights, when the moon cast shadows over the marshes and fields, Allard would sit by his fire, Thomas among his ledgers, Jory at the edge of a dock whispering to fishermen, and Rowan atop a ridge watching roads stretch into the fog, four men separated by distance, yet united in domination. Each knew that power was a coin more precious than gold. Once it passed hands, it demanded tribute, obedience, and occasionally blood. Thus begins the real terror of the Black-Handed, not in the first act of murder, but in the way their work evolved into a quiet, invisible tyranny over the countryside. And the people, bound by fear, learned that survival sometimes required more cunning than law, more silence than speech, and more coins than conscience. The stage was set for what would come next, a series of calculated moves that would extend their reach even further, testing the limits of human fear, cunning, and the fragile line between life and death. By the autumn of that year, the Black-Handed had grown almost untouchable in East Anglia. Fear was now a currency. They spent freely, shaping villages, towns, and even minor lords, according to their whims. Each of the four men had honed their methods. Allard moved in shadows, ensuring no deal ever went unrecorded. Thomas manipulated contracts, deeds, and letters to bend reality to his design. Jory spread rumors that could ignite panic or ruin reputations. And Rowan enforced compliance, demonstrating the lethal consequences of disobedience. Together, even from distance, they created a network of control stronger than law itself. It began with a small village near the marshes, one previously untouched by their influence. Amilla had refused to pay his dues to a distant lord, believing he could cheat the system. Rowan, with a few trusted men, rode into the village under the guise of travelers seeking lodging. At night, they cut the locks on barns, moved livestock, and left a single message pinned to the miller's door: obedience is survival. By dawn, the villagers had surrendered dues they hadn't known they owed. Rowan's reputation alone sufficed. He didn't need to raise a hand in open violence. Meanwhile, Allard and Thomas coordinated a silent coup of commerce in the nearby towns. Allard arranged for key merchants to misplace goods, forcing them to borrow from Thomas's accounts to cover shortages. Thomas, in turn, rewrote the debts so that the merchants unknowingly transferred wealth into their hands. By the time anyone noticed, it was too late. A widow with an inheritance found her lands quietly reassigned. A baker discovered his flour stocks pledged elsewhere. Every action left no trace of malice, only confusion and a slow, growing sense of dread. Jory, as always, was the unseen whisperer. He spread rumors of supernatural favor and divine punishment, of men who disappeared after ignoring their debts, and of mysterious figures seen near the rivers at night. Merchants avoided traveling alone. Farmers double-checked every contract. Even priests hesitated before giving absolution to anyone suspected of crossing the black-handed. Rumors became as powerful as weapons, sometimes more so, because fear could paralyze action. Their influence was not limited to money or property. Rowan began to manipulate justice itself. A corrupt constable who had once pursued them now found himself quietly coerced, his letters intercepted, his authority undermined, his reputation threatened by Jory's carefully placed gossip. Within months, the constable was removed, replaced by a man who owed his position to Allard's unseen hand. Suddenly, the killers were not just feared for what they could take, but for what they could make others do. One particular case tested their reach. A nobleman from a distant county had begun consolidating lands that overlapped the territories controlled by the black-handed. He was rich, ambitious, and careless. Allard sent letters in Thomas's hand, suggesting alliances and offering false intelligence. Jory whispered rumors of betrayal and impending danger. Rowan appeared near his manors at night, silent but ominous. By the time the nobleman realized what was happening, he had lost multiple estates, incurred debts to unknown parties, and been forced to swear loyalty to men he had never met. Even among themselves, the four men operated with cold efficiency. They held no counsel beyond necessity. Allard calculated, Thomas documented, Jory observed, Rowan executed. When news reached them of resistance, Rowan would strike, often using villagers to unwittingly enforce his commands. Allard adjusted plans. Thomas covered tracks. Jory spread whispers to mislead potential enemies. Their methods were surgical. By the end of the harvest, almost every town between Norwich and King's Lynn had felt their touch. Yet the most terrifying aspect was their subtlety. No single act could be traced to them without careful investigation, and even then, it often appeared as coincidence, misfortune, or divine will. People learned to comply, sometimes even over-complying, because resistance was too dangerous to contemplate. They became not mere killers for hire, but invisible rulers, holding sway over life, commerce, and fear. Late one night, in a ruined chapel, where Allard had taken temporary shelter, the four reunited briefly. Rowan's hands bore scars from recent intimidation. Jory's eyes gleamed with information he had gathered. Thomas carried ledgers of wealth quietly shifted. Allard pored over maps and notes, plotting the next moves. They spoke little. Each understood the unspoken truth. Power was an endless game, and the moment one relaxed, the world could strike back. Outside, the wind rustled through broken stone and moss. Shadows stretched across the ground, as if the land itself acknowledged the presence of men who had turned fear into a weapon. Even the animals seemed wary. Horses snorted, dogs whined in distant yards, and in the towns and villages, people spoke quietly of the black-handed, never naming them directly, but always whispering of four figures whose influence could reach into every home, every purse, and every heart. Their empire of fear was now complete in its own way. No longer mere killers for coin, they had become arbiters of destiny, shaping the fates of men without raising a hand, at least not openly. And as night fell over the marshes, over the fields, and over the towns they silently controlled. The legend of the Black-Handed grew, not just as murderers, but as men whose presence alone could bend life to their will. From this point, the story moves into its darkest chapters, where power, once obtained, begins to demand a price greater than coin, and where even the cleverest men must confront the consequences of ruling through terror. Winter returned, heavier and more bitter than the last. Frost lined the riverbanks, smoke from chimneys hung low, and the air carried a constant chill that seeped into bone. The Black-Handed, however, did not slow. Their network of influence had expanded into towns and villages where they were almost a force of nature. Fear had become routine, woven into every contract, every land transfer, every whispered rumor. The four men now operated with near-legendary status: Allard as the strategist, Thomas as the manipulator of documents and wealth, Jory as the master of rumor, and Rowan as the enforcer of obedience. It began with a dispute over a newly built mill in a small village by the fens. The miller had refused to pay a levy imposed by the local lord, believing he was clever enough to ignore it. Rowan, mounted and masked in a dark cloak, arrived at night with 3 accomplices. They circled the mill silently, cutting ropes and leaving subtle threats etched into the doorframe. By morning, the miller had paid triple the levy, convinced that failure to comply would bring far worse. Allard had sent word to Thomas, who manipulated the tax records to make the payment seem legitimate and official. Jory, unseen, had spread stories of the Shadow Riders who punished defiance, ensuring compliance throughout the region. The four men's influence was not limited to punishment. They had begun orchestrating entire towns like pieces on a chessboard. In one coastal settlement, Allard arranged a series of small accidents to remove key figures opposed to their will. Thomas ensured the property transfers appeared legitimate, written into contracts that no one could contest. Jory whispered tales of curses, spirits, and ill fortune, terrifying villagers into submission. Rowan executed threats where whispers failed, his presence alone often enough to bend men to their designs. By the end of the season, the town had reorganized itself entirely under their silent control. Even the wealthier merchants and minor nobles found themselves at their mercy. A nobleman attempting to consolidate estates was outmaneuvered by Thomas, whose forgeries and manipulations made him believe he had lost land through his own mistakes. Allard ensured that every move was calculated, leaving no trace of interference. Jory spread rumors that the nobleman had angered unseen forces. Rowan appeared at strategic moments, demonstrating power without committing outright violence, a living warning that compliance was cheaper than defiance. The terror spread quietly, like ink seeping into water. Travelers spoke of four men who could be anywhere, yet never together. Merchants paid in advance, farmers obeyed unseen demands, even priests hesitated to intervene, wary of becoming entangled. Those who resisted often disappeared under circumstances the villagers would never speak of openly. The Black-Handed had evolved from killers for hire into a network of silent domination, shaping life and death across the countryside without ever showing their full hands. By midwinter, the four gathered once more in the ruins of an old chapel, a place of stone and cold where only the wind could carry sound. They shared news in low voices. Rowan described the latest acts of enforcement, including a local bailiff convinced to resign after an anonymous threat. Jory recounted rumors that had destabilized a merchant guild, ensuring the Black-Handed's clients gained profit. Thomas detailed new contracts he had rewritten to transfer property and wealth. Allard, as always, planned the next moves, noting which towns and villages could be influenced next, which officials were weak enough to manipulate, and which individuals might require Rowan's presence to ensure obedience. Despite their mastery, cracks began to appear. Rumors of betrayal reached their ears, whispers that one might claim more than his share, that a contract might be ignored, that a client might betray them to the sheriff. Even in a world ruled by fear, uncertainty remained. But the four men were careful, calculating, and ruthless in maintaining loyalty. Their empire was built on intimidation, secrecy, and precise action. Any threat to it was eliminated swiftly and quietly. And so the winter deepened, each night bringing longer shadows and colder winds. The Black-Handed moved like a silent plague across the countryside, their influence stretching unseen into every market, village, and manor. People whispered, feared, and obeyed, some out of self-preservation, others in awe of the invisible power that had grown from mere coin and murder into a force capable of shaping entire communities. As the season wore on, the stage was set for the darkest chapter of all. The Black-Handed were no longer simply murderers. They were masters of fear, manipulators of fate, and rulers of a silent empire that stretched across East Anglia. And in that empire, every move was calculated, every action deliberate, and every life measured against the cold, precise logic of men who had learned that terror was more powerful than law, more effective than gold, and far more enduring than mercy. The countryside held its breath, unaware that the Black-Handed were watching, waiting, and preparing to test the limits of their dominion. The first cracks in resistance would soon appear, and when they did, the consequences would be merciless. Spring returned again, but the land seemed different. The frost had long melted, birds nested in the eaves, and villagers resumed their daily routines. Yet, the memory of the Black-Handed lingered like a shadow over every path, every market, every home. By now, their names, Allard, Thomas, Jory, and Rowan, were whispered in fear, not as men, but as forces that shaped the course of life itself. The culmination of their work came when a powerful nobleman, Sir Geoffrey Harcourt, attempted to reclaim control over several villages the killers had influenced. He was wealthy, proud, and arrogant, the perfect test of their abilities. Allard orchestrated the plan with precision. Thomas forged documents showing Sir Geoffrey's holdings were already pledged to other parties. Jory spread rumors that the nobleman had made a pact with rebels and heretics. Rowan, the enforcer, appeared in towns at night, demonstrating power and inciting fear. By the time Sir Geoffrey moved to assert authority, the villagers had already turned against him, convinced that defiance would bring ruin. The nobleman's efforts failed utterly. His lands were lost, his influence shattered, and his pride destroyed. He publicly accused unknown conspirators, but no evidence could be found, and no man dared speak their names aloud. Even the sheriff, long removed from the initial hunts, could do nothing. The killers had transformed from hired assassins into an unstoppable force, ruling through fear, manipulation, and reputation alone. By midsummer, the four men met for the last time in the ruins of a once great abbey. Allard, now gray and calculating, counted the wealth and influence they had accumulated. Thomas reviewed ledgers, ensuring every gain was secured and every potential loose end addressed. Jory shared tales of rumors and stories he had carefully planted across the shires. Rowan, as always, checked the perimeter, ensuring that even in secrecy they remained untouchable. "I suppose this is the end," Allard said finally, voice low. "We have no more rivals, no one to challenge our reach. Perhaps it is time to disappear before the world catches up." Thomas nodded, closing his ledger. "Our work is done. There is nothing left but survival and silence. Let the world remember the Black-Handed as a shadow feared, respected, and unseen." Jory smiled faintly, the hint of mischief still in his eyes. "Then we vanish like smoke. Let stories of us linger. Let fear do the rest. No one will ever know the truth, only the echo of our deeds." Rowan stood silent, his gaze fixed on the horizon, where the sun touched the marshes. "And if anyone tries to follow?" he asked. Allard's lips curved slightly. "They will find nothing, only tales, whispers, and fear, and that is enough. One by one, the four men walked into different directions, leaving no trace of their presence. Some went to distant cities, others to remote villages. Some disappeared into forests and marshes, their paths known only to themselves. The empire they built was invisible now, yet its effects endured, fear that guided behavior, obedience bought through terror, and a legacy whispered from generation to generation. Years passed. People told stories around hearths of the black-handed four men who killed, manipulated, and ruled without ever being seen together. Some said they were cursed, others that they were blessed with unnatural cunning, but all agreed on one thing: their deeds were real, and their power, though invisible, had reshaped the land forever. And so ends the story of Thomas, Jory, and Rowan. Not with a bloody battle or public execution, but with mastery complete, a legacy of fear, control, and skill that would echo in East Anglia for decades. A grim reminder that men who trade in death and cunning leave more than corpses behind. They leave a shadow over every life they touch. The countryside returned to its routine, but in the wind that rustled through the fields, in the fog that clung to the marshes, and in the whispers of villagers who told the tale, the black-handed remained, unseen, untouchable, eternal in memory.